The suspension came on a Thursday morning. No press conference. No dramatic announcement. Just a brief official statement from the league office, released quietly between two other pieces of administrative news, as though the people who wrote it were hoping it might be absorbed without too much attention. It was not. Within 40 minutes, it was the most discussed item in baseball. Within 2 hours, the story had grown a second layer, one that nobody in the league office had included in their carefully worded statement, but that multiple reporters were already confirming through separate sources. Illegal gambling. The home plate umpire who had been suspended. The same man who had converged on Shohei Ohtani in the 7th inning. The same man whose motivations Dave Roberts had questioned publicly. The same man whose conduct had triggered a league review. That man was now the subject of a full investigation. And suddenly, everything that had looked like bias had a possible explanation. A darker one. A more dangerous one. One that nobody in baseball wanted to be true, but that nobody could afford to ignore. Let's go back to where this started. Not the suspension. Not the investigation. Earlier than that. Back to the moment that, in hindsight, was the first sign that something was wrong. The bat threat. It happened during a stoppage in play. The cameras caught fragments of it, enough for lip readers and broadcast analysts to reconstruct what had been said, enough for the clip to circulate within hours of the game ending. The home plate umpire, in a moment that he almost certainly believed was private, had leaned toward Ohtani during a disputed call and said words that no umpire is permitted to say to any player. He had referenced Ohtani's bat. He had made clear, in language that required no translation, what he thought should happen to it. It was not a warning. It was not frustration venting in the heat of the moment. The people who reviewed the footage, and there were several, in the days that followed, before any of this became public, described it consistently as a threat. Deliberate. Personal. Directed. Ohtani had not responded. He had looked at the umpire for exactly 1 second. Then he had stepped back into the batter's box and hit the next pitch into the gap in left center field for a double. That was who he was. That was how he answered. But the moment had been captured. And captured moments, in the age of broadcast technology and frame-by-frame analysis, do not stay private for long. The suspension announcement listed 4 games. It covered 2 umpires, the home plate umpire and the first base umpire who had participated in the bat confiscation. The language of the suspension cited repeated conduct unbecoming of a major league official, specifically referencing multiple at-bats across 2 separate games in which the strike zone application was found to be materially inconsistent with both the rulebook definition and the umpire's own established patterns from prior assignments. That last phrase was the significant one. Materially inconsistent with the umpire's own established patterns. What the league was saying, in the careful language of official documents, was that this was not simply a bad night. This was not a fatigued umpire missing pitches in both directions equally. The calls that went against Ohtani, the borderline pitches called balls, the confiscated bat, the behavior captured on broadcast cameras, did not match how this umpire called games when Ohtani was not involved. When he was behind the plate for other games, against other lineups, his zone was consistent. Accurate, even. Within the normal range of human error that everyone in baseball accepts as part of the game. When Ohtani batted, something changed. The league had gone back through 6 games. 6 separate appearances at the plate. They had run every pitch through tracking data. They had compared the called zone to the umpire's historical zone. And what they found was a pattern that could not be explained by fatigue or difficulty reading the pitch or the ordinary variance of human judgment. 4 games was the suspension length. But the number of games had already stopped being the story. The gambling allegations surfaced the same afternoon the suspension was announced. They did not come from the league. They came from 2 separate reporters, working independently, who had each been developing the story for several days before the suspension gave them the context to publish it. The details were specific. The umpire had, according to sources cited in both reports, been in contact with individuals connected to sports betting operations. The nature of those contacts, whether they constituted a formal arrangement, whether money had changed hands, whether specific games or specific outcomes had been discussed, was not confirmed. The investigation, at the point of publication, was still in its earliest stages. But the question that both reporters asked, in different words, was the same question that every person reading those stories immediately asked themselves. If an umpire was connected to gambling interests, if someone, somewhere, stood to benefit financially from specific outcomes in specific games, what would be the most effective thing for that umpire to do? Not fix the outcome of a game directly. That is too visible, too traceable, too risky. Something subtler. Something that operates below the threshold of immediate detection. Something like repeatedly squeezing the strike zone against the player most likely to change the score. Something like creating situations, disruptions, inspections, disputed calls, that affect momentum, affect pitch counts, affect the rhythm of a team's best player at the moments that matter most. Nobody was saying that was what had happened. The investigation was ongoing. The umpire had not been charged with anything. Due process existed for a reason. But the question was in the room now. And once a question like that enters a room, it does not leave quietly. Dave Roberts was asked about the gambling allegations at his next availability. He sat with the question for a long moment before answering. Longer than he usually sits with anything. "I'm not going to comment on an active investigation," he said. "That's not my place, and it wouldn't be appropriate." He paused. "What I will say is this. When I stood up after that game and said what I said about the home plate umpire, when I used the word personal, I was working from what I had observed over several games. I was working from what our coaching staff had documented. I was not making a wild accusation. I was describing a pattern that our organization had been tracking." His hands were flat on the table. His voice was steady. "Whether that pattern has an explanation beyond personal bias, that is for the investigators to determine. I hope they determine it thoroughly. Because if what is being reported turns out to be true, this is not just a story about Shohei Ohtani. This is a story about the integrity of the game itself." He leaned back slightly. "And that matters to everyone. Not just the Dodgers. Everyone." The Players Association released a statement the same evening. It was 3 paragraphs long. The first acknowledged the suspensions and expressed support for the league's process. The second called for full transparency in the gambling investigation. The third paragraph was the one that players around the league were texting to each other within the hour. It said, in formal language that barely contained its directness, that no player, regardless of profile, nationality, or prominence, should be subjected to conduct from officiating staff that appears motivated by anything other than the fair application of the rules of the game. It noted that the union had been made aware of documented incidents involving the umpire in question and Ohtani specifically. It stated that the union considered the matter serious enough to assign its own legal team to monitor the investigation's progress. That was the Players Association saying, in the language of institutions, "We have seen the evidence. We believe our player was targeted. We are watching." Somewhere in all of this, in the statements and the investigations and the carefully chosen words of managers and union officials, there was a human being who had simply come to play baseball. Ohtani's public comment on the gambling allegations was, characteristically, almost nothing. A reporter found a brief window before a practice session. Asked him directly whether he had been aware, during those games, that something felt different about the way he was being officiated. Ohtani considered the question. He picked up a batting glove from the bench beside him and turned it over in his hands once. "Every game feels different," he said. "Different pitcher, different conditions, different zone. You adjust. That's the job." The reporter followed up, "But did any of it feel unfair?" Ohtani looked up. "There were calls I disagreed with," he said quietly. There were situations I didn't understand. But I don't know what was behind them. That's not mine to know. I just kept hitting. He stood up. The conversation was over. He had answered the question in exactly the way he answers everything, without drama, without grievance, with a simplicity that somehow carries more weight than a long speech would. He just kept hitting. Against a zone that was narrowing on him specifically. Against an umpire who had threatened his bat in a moment of rage. Against a pattern that investigators were now calling potentially corrupt. He just kept hitting. The investigation remains ongoing. The suspended umpires have not spoken publicly. The gambling connections are being traced through processes that move slowly and carefully by design. Baseball has been here before, not often, but enough times to know how the story goes when the integrity of officiating is questioned at the highest level. It goes slowly. It goes painfully. And it ends, eventually, with either accountability or with questions that are never fully answered. What is different this time is the player at the center of it. Shohei Ohtani did not ask to be the subject of a league investigation. He did not ask to be the player whose at-bats became data points in a pattern analysis. He did not ask to be the man whose bat was threatened in a moment that a camera happened to capture. He asked for nothing except a fair zone and a chance to play the game at the level he is capable of playing it. Whether he got either of those things, whether the calls he received across 6 documented games represented human error or something far more deliberate, is what the investigators are now trying to determine. The evidence is in. The suspensions are served. The investigation is running. And Ohtani, somewhere in all of it, is in a batting cage. Getting ready for the next pitch. Because that is the only thing he has ever known how to do.